Hello. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the books that disappointed me in 2023. So I overall had quite a lovely reading year. I only disliked 4 books, like 4 of the 70 new to me books, not including my rereads. I'm not just talking about books I disliked, though. I'm talking about books that I was disappointed in. So they held some sort of expectation for me in my mind that was not satisfied, and I only have 5. But one of them's a series, so I'm just including that as one. So I don't really actually have that much to talk about. Let's just get into it. So the first one is The Removed by Hobson. So this is the story of a Cherokee family, and the family is a bit older. There are 3 children. One of them died as a teenager. He was killed by a police officer. The girl is just kind of living her life, and the son doesn't live nearby and is a drug addict. And the parents are older, and the mother is caring for her husband, who is starting to get onset of dementia. We're coming up to the celebration that they do of Ray, their late son's passing, and they get asked to foster an Indigenous youth. I think that this book would have been better if it was longer, which I don't normally say very often. But I have read the author's debut, and I thought it had potential, and so that's why I picked this book up. And I ended up being more disappointed by this than by his debut. And I think a lot of it has to do with the relationship between the boy and the parents, and the connection of everyone's stories together, because you're getting the 2 living children's perspectives and stories, and you're getting the mother and her watching and kind of falling in love with the foster child. And it's all over the course of less than a week, so the relationships have just felt very unearned and quick. And I think that this book would have benefited from a few more scenes, it taking place over the course of maybe a month instead of maybe a week. Just a little bit more oomph to all of the relationships, because it fell on shaky ground, and because that was kind of the whole concept of the book, it was just hard to believe, and I didn't really end up enjoying it. It's not a plot book. There's not a lot of narrative push. It's really about the characters and the relationships between them, so you really have to sell them to me well, and that just didn't happen here. Okay, the next one we'll talk about is the Brandon Sanderson one. So this is, it has such a long name, the Frugal Wizards Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. I found this to be lackluster for a Brandon Sanderson book. So with Brandon Sanderson, I've come to expect an interesting world, a fun plot, and a way that he turns something on its head. A lot of the time it's a trope expectation, so that could be a plot trope, or that could be a character trope, something like that. But something gets turned on its head, and something isn't what you expect it to be. I think that for me, that is the core of what was missing in this book. This takes place in a postmodern world where we have access to a lot of technology, and we now have access to the multiverse, and that has been capitalized by a company that can sell you a world. And they sell it to you during medieval time, and you can do whatever you want with it. And you're following a protagonist, and we have an amnesia trope where he comes into one of these parts of the multiverse, and he doesn't know why he's there, and he doesn't know how he's there, and he doesn't know what's happening, and he doesn't know who he is. And then he meets people who live there locally. I just found him to be an annoying protagonist, and I found the plot to be simplistic. It was a very straightforward quest novel, and I found him to be, the protagonist, to just really be annoying. And it was kind of one of these, you could be whoever you want to be. you're not stuck with being the human you are today. You can change yourself. And the way that the protagonist kind of comes to terms with that and comes to understand that is just kind of like, I was like, yeah, I get it, cool. Like, how old is the character I'm reading? He's just now figuring this out. Yikes. Yeah, so overall, just in terms of Sanderson, it was a disappointment. I didn't dislike the reading experience except for the star rating system of the protagonist. Good Lord, I was so annoyed by that. But I feel like I've talked about this book enough, so we will move on to the next one. The next one will just finish up my fantasy. This is the series, and this is, oh God, what's the name of the series? Okay, this is the Song of the Shattered Sands series. So I committed to the long haul with this. I read 6 main books and 6 short stories or novellas. So I read 12 books, and the main series books were like 500-ish pages long. The thing is, I knew I was going to be disappointed by it, but I was like so committed to reading it and just finishing it that I did. So I kind of got what I knew I was going to get, but I was hoping for like a good ending, which in all fairness, book 6, I thought wrapped itself up okay. I think this is the type of book that a lot of non-fantasy readers think all fantasy is like. And it's like breakneck plot that is straightforward, or like is straightforward while being like overly unnecessarily complicated to make the plot go on longer, and boring and undeveloped characters. And I think that like when I was a non-fantasy reader and I stuck my nose up at fantasy, I think that was the type of stuff that I thought all fantasy was like, which is just a complete farce for any of you watching that don't like fantasy. I argue that you in fact do, you just haven't tried the right stuff yet, because fantasy is not a monopoly, and like who doesn't like things that can't happen in the real world happening in your plots? Like, I don't know. Anyway, totally different subject. I actually have a whole review on this book, so if you had any interest in reading this series and you were curious about it, you could watch my review, my guide to the series. That was part of the reason I actually finished it, so I can make those, because I actually really enjoy making fantasy guides. I think that the thing that I disliked in this, which for me is bad fantasy writing, is what I like to call plot stacking. And that's basically what I want a plot to do. Is I want you to like give me little tidbits, and it can build, and those things can build into each other, and you're like, oh, this is connected to this, that's so interesting. Or it can kind of build out, and you have this like piece of information, and then it kind of builds and builds and builds, and your world expands, and you're like, whoa. But this is like, it just stacks. It feels linear. It's like this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. And it doesn't feel like they're all connected to each other. It feels disparate. It's just like the author wanted you to be here, and then they wanted you to be here. And like there's no stakes and no connection, and it doesn't feel like the characters are motivating the plot progression. It feels like the author wanted the plot to go there, and the characters were secondary, which I don't really like in my fantasy. So a lot to say without telling you anything about the series at all, but just don't read it. Don't read it. They're a better fantasy. Yeah, okay, we'll go on to this one. So the next one is Chain Gang All-Stars. So I didn't like how everything came together. We're in a futuristic America where there is a law that is passed that people can, prison systems, you can enroll in a program where you fight to the death, and people do it on TV. And it is a reality show, and it's monetized, and, you know, all of that. In terms of the plot itself of that, like conceptually that's interesting. I mean, it's not a concept that has not existed in time, but it's an interesting concept, and it was not an interesting plot for me. I wasn't really interested in the characters. We kind of bounced around to a lot of different characters, and some of them fell very flat. Some of them I didn't really care about their motivations, and overall I think that the author was trying to do too much and it didn't resolve well. Like on the back of the book, it describes it as like a kaleidoscope, and I think that it's like, for me, it's like when you look at a kaleidoscope, you know, and you're turning it, and if you ever have it get stuck and you're like kind of in between two kaleidoscope images and you're not really seeing anything interesting, that is how it felt for me. So I didn't dislike it, but I was honestly just disappointed by it because it had so much hype around it, and people in the bookish community, because like they know I like genre fantasy, and this had genre elements to it, like kind of hyped it up for me, and so I hyped it up for myself, and I was just disappointed by it. Okay, and the last one, I normally don't put these in any order, but I do feel like this is my biggest disappointment, and it's The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. Now, I love Sarah Waters, and this was my last book of hers, and it was unfortunately my least favorite book. So I like Sarah Waters for a number of reasons. She always writes really interesting characters. Her plots are always interesting. She always has like a good plot twist, and she touches on really interesting themes of like class and feminism, and she kind of goes all over the place with them. And I didn't really feel like thematically this one was very interesting. This is like her gothic horror, and you're following a male doctor as he kind of ingratiates himself into this used to be wealthy family who still owns a very large estate that they can't take care of. And it's like kind of like is it a psychological thriller or is it not a psychological thriller? And I found the resolution of that concept to be just dissatisfying, and it didn't really feel like she had an answer that she knew herself, because I can have an open ending, but I don't know. This one was just weird. The psychological parts of this is like, are they all crazy or are they not? Like, is it the house that's turning them mad or is it not? Are they actually crazy? Like, who knows? And I think that Fingersmith does a way better job with that. There is of like the touching on psychology and how it was treated in past days. Fingersmith and The Little Stranger take place in very different times. Fingersmith is Victorian, while The Little Stranger is in the 50s, but it just was not as interesting of a display here. I found the ending to be quite disappointing. I didn't think that the characters were all that interesting. Don't know what would have kept my interest in this book if it wasn't actually Sarah Waters who wrote it. If her name was not on this book, I probably would have DNF'd it. I'm not mad that I finished it because I did want to complete all of her works, but yeah, overall, it was just disappointing for me. I was kind of sad, and I was like, I wish I didn't leave this one for last. But those were all the books that disappointed me. Only 5. Isn't that exciting? Of like the 70 books I've read, maybe a little more, 75. But anyway, that's all I have for this video. Tell me about your most disappointing books of the year. I will be making a video of my favorites of the year, and spoilers, I had a lot of favorites. I have had to narrow down my list and use the more like superlative concept. But anyway, that's all I got. So until next time, happy reading.